This is MagnetiK Mumma, the podcast where we parent with nervous system wisdom, soul-led grit, and zero shame. Hey, I'm Steph, your holistic nurse, writer, and a mum who is keeping it real while living in the chaos. And I'm giving you permission to raise resilient kids without losing yourself. Because when you thrive, your kids can too. So let's get into the messy middle and find our magic. Hey there, and welcome to MagnetiK Mumma. I'm Steph, holistic nurse, parent advocate, and writer. And this episode is exploring what it looks like to belong in a moving world. And in light of some heated kind of situations around Australia, in particular around migration, I am not here to tell anyone what to think, feel, or how to act, but I am curious to explore how our behaviors and these types of sceneries that we're creating, how that influences young people and how they think and how we're influencing the thoughts that they will think in the future, and just to kind of explore what we're hoping as parents to pass on to our kids. So I look forward to this episode, and we'll be going through a few things that include looking at research and the science behind conditioning and what influences young people to form values and belief systems and why that's important. And I think in my world, I feel like I would cop a lot of criticism because often I feel like when I share my views, people around me struggle to understand where I'm coming from, criticize my lack of Australianality, perhaps, having grown up in a very farmer community, which I believe gave me beautiful foundations for kindness, compassion, and inclusivity. Yet I'm also conscious that that was not necessarily always the sentiment of the community around me. So whilst I've been blessed to have grown up in that space, I was very safe, I was very well fed, I was loved. So I am lucky to have had all of those things: safety, roof over our head, and people who loved me, even if at times I wasn't always the easiest person to love. So, I'm very conscious and grateful of where I come from. But I think something that was really evident in my life story anyway, from a very young age, that I often feel like I thought differently and didn't always fit the mold of the society I was living in, even though I was very safe and very nourished and very loved. So in being in an environment like that, obviously I was conditioned to think a certain way. The food we ate was very wholesome. My grandfather is from the US and migrated to Australia in the 70s and brought his whole family over, which was only supposed to be for a couple of years, and they ended up staying here a lifetime, which is how I came about. But he was a dyslexic entomologist, studied in California, and brought his wisdom from the Californian agricultural belts over to the South Australian agricultural belts. And in that way, I had some cultural differences in my family from the community we were growing up in. And I believe that was definitely a contributor to the mindset and formulation of my thinking, and, to be honest, my curiosity. My granddad always talked about the US being a melting pot of multiculturalism, and maybe it wasn't the US, maybe it was more Hawaii that he spoke of, but recognizing that it was a part of the human evolutionary process. So even though we were of American descent, we still faced some cultural differences from the little country town of Australia that we grew up in. And I can only imagine what it must have been like for kids who weren't of Anglo background and having vastly different cultural practices and experiences that weren't even similar to this little country town that I grew up in. So I guess what I'm trying to explore in this podcast is how do we even form our own beliefs and our own values, and where have they come from, and how have they been shaped by our environment, by our social setting, upbringing, by our economic status, because that's often a big one in Australia. We don't necessarily have castes, but there is this sort of unspoken hierarchy of, particularly in a small town, of how you fit in based on what car you drive, where you live, and what kind of house you live in. And to some extent, I believe that still happens today. So really just digging in a little bit to the science and the narratives around community norms, like neuroplasticity is now evidence-based. So we are capable of changing our neural pathways, which then form our thoughts, behaviors, and bias networks. But when we're young and absorbing and forming these neural pathways, they kind of set the stage of what's going to happen in our future, or how we're going to think, or what we're expecting from the world around us. So how are those shaped and formed by the environments or the societies or the homes that we're in? And I think as parents, it's really important to take the time to reflect and observe your own bias networks and check in and see, how are they still relevant in this timeline? So I hope you find this interesting, because this is something I geek out on. So it became really apparent to me, or reinforced to me when I was working with young people, how much young people absorb. I spend a lot of time going back to my inner child in meditation and consoling her in certain situations that were beyond her control, but as a result, she developed certain schemas around specific things. And for me, one big one was having a birthmark and feeling judged because my birthmark made me different from all the other kids. And then how that formulated behavior patterns and self-esteem and confidence. Life is confronting and confusing and exploratory and unknown. So I was blessed to have that space to do that, but it still didn't necessarily mean that I didn't formulate stories that weren't healthy. And then when you look to media, because back in those days we had like Dolly magazine and Cleo and, you know, beautiful long-legged gorgeous women who were stunning. And even hilarious as this is, I thought one day maybe I could be a model. You know, we used to help out our mum's friend doing kids modelling and stuff, and I really loved being on stage, but that soon got knocked out of me because it was made apparent that my body shape and having a birthmark was not going to be favourable for anyone who wanted to present their clothing or what have you. So it was reinforced to me that that was not the ideal career path, which, you know, I can see now, but it set off this pattern of I am not able to be on stage when sometimes I really loved it and I loved being the center of attention, and that stopped. And I taught myself to hide and keep safe and not put myself out there because I will be judged by others, which is also true. And the fact that that is true, but whether or not it influences my behavior is the point that I'm trying to make. So just being aware of and conscious of the way that we speak to people. And again, I feel like in my circle of community that I grew up in, not necessarily now, but people will just be like, oh, back in my day, we didn't have to worry about that. And God, kids these days, they're so sensitive, or, you know, then they don't even know how to do this or that. And it's those things, as helpful as we might think they are to say those things to toughen our kids up and harden them up and eat a bit of concrete, it actually can trigger kids to form beliefs about themselves and create patterns. And I guess the one thing that I learned working with young people is about the ability to be resilient to those types of things and how to overcome them, which is a skill that we started recognizing was becoming less and less prevalent in young people. And it wasn't necessarily their fault, because perhaps it wasn't being taught to them from the outside environment. It was rather reinforced that you just swallow it and get on with it, because that's how we do things. And we all know with science, with research, that is, yes, you can do that. And yes, it works for some people, but there comes a point where it's no longer effective. And when it isn't effective, how do you unblock it and unlock it so that you can get back to being effective? And the process of that situation can be one day, it can be 100 years, or it may never happen at all. So I think being conscious about the messaging you're giving your young people is integral. Or just checking yourself about where your own biases come from to ensure that it's not something you're subconsciously passing on that is unhealed or no longer relevant. It's no longer relevant. Some things our parents taught us were perfect for the time that we were in them and served a purpose, but are they, as an adult, now serving you? And by subconsciously passing them on, are they serving your young people? Or is it actually hindering them from being the best version of themselves? So I'm passionate about creating safe spaces for young people. It's not woo-woo, it's not soft. I believe prevention is better than cure. That's been my training over the last 20 years. I work in health education, health promotion, and the seeds of my work does not get seen until 20 years later. It's hard because instant gratification doesn't come, but I know the science and the research backs that up, and I have to stick true to it. So in believing that sharing information now with parents, having the experience of working with young people, having explored the psychology and science and mind-body-soul connection or mind-body-essence connection, I feel like sharing some of this information gives parents permission to not be perfect and allow them to hold their views and values and beliefs. I do not want to skew anyone to think that one belief or one value is better than the other. But my question is, as adults who have young people in their lives, how can we ensure we're creating safe spaces for our young people so that they can thrive? And sometimes some of the conditioning that they are being exposed to, for example, the debate over migration in Australia, I think as a society, it's really important to reflect on what is relevant now and in this time and place, because going back to the past is impossible. But we can learn so much from our ancestors and our old people. We know, and I am very blessed, my kids have access to phenomenal education, and their school is led by someone who is so inspiring to me. And So I really value thought leaders who take education to the next level. My kid's principal was sharing her journey over to Oxford University and talking about what does that look like for our young people in the future. And things that I took from that are that our futures or our kids' futures are not going to look like our present in terms of how they are going to live or earn or survive or hopefully thrive in the future is beyond our comprehension. With the evolution of AI and technology, there are things that are happening that we can't even imagine. So how do we future-proof our kids in a way that they are able to evolve and adapt to what is coming? Because we can't imagine what is coming. So what skills do kids need to evolve and adapt? And I think knowing the science, knowing that the brain uses mental shortcuts called heuristics to manage overwhelming information, like the psychological experiment where, you know, the gorilla runs, people are throwing the ball to each other, and then suddenly a gorilla comes through. Now, whether your brain recognizes it or not, it's there, right? So our brain creates these shortcuts to manage because so much information. And imagine now what our young people are facing with social media and Netflix and all the entertainment on top of what they have to learn in school and sports and extracurricular and living as humans in these current times, friendships, connections, relationships. There's a lot of information pouring into their sponge-like brains. So, you know, the brain naturally creates these shortcuts to help them recognize and make connections in a quicker way. So it leads to these cognitive biases that sort of confirm and enable them to back up the information they're learning. You know, sometimes when you're driving along the road and you haven't seen a yellow car, but someone says, oh, what do my kids call it when they see a spotto? And they see a yellow car. And then, you know, the next 5 cars are yellow, whereas before you wouldn't have even noticed those 5 yellow cars if no one had pointed them out to you. And it creates this sort of confirmation bias, and it feels like everybody has a yellow car. And then this sort of frames the thought processes to connect things together and put them in little groups. And that can contribute to forming judgments and beliefs. And then once those beliefs are made, they sort of can be reinforced. And particularly if we're reinforcing specific narratives in the home, these kids learn to believe that that is true, or that is true of this person, or that is true of these situations, or these groups of people, or what have you. So again, I think it's very, very, very important to check ourselves as parents and ensure to make safe spaces that we are aware. Neuroscience, right? I love a bit of neuroscience. I'm learning, I'm expanding my knowledge on neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I am drawn to listen to podcasts, and I'm particularly curious about social psychology. So these 2 research groups have found that the brain categorizes in and out groups, right? And that acts like a lever, which then triggers biases. And these biases then can influence how we perceive others. So in your home environment, if you're reinforcing specific messages about specific groups of people, you are helping your young people form these biases and they're influencing how they perceive others. At times, it can create prejudice, and if it's coming from your home environment, it can be deeply embedded into their subconscious minds. And even if they don't intentionally act out in ways that seem prejudiced or offensive, it can happen. So there's an interesting opposing thought to this, is that I cannot control anybody else, or I cannot even control how other people perceive things, right? When I just said the opposite is true. That is also true. The only thing I can control is the way I respond. So as an adult, I can understand that concept. But as a young person, that is something that takes time. Although I kind of disagree. Again, sorry to jump around, because young people are highly intuitive, and young people, especially little kids, they don't see color, race, or disability. They kind of just accept what is. It's only when the influence of the conditioning of the environment and the prejudice of the parent, or the way the parent responds to the child's reaction, will embed how the child chooses to respond in the future. So it's an oxymoron, and it's not an easy problem to solve, and it's not one that we actually need to fix. What I'm trying to express here is that if we are mindful of how our words and behaviors and actions are influencing the conditioning of a sponge-like child mind, then we have a great responsibility to ensure how we feed that mind is, in my view, and I'm pretty sure not everybody agrees with this, and that's okay. Everyone's entitled to their own opinions. Why does any of what I'm saying matter? Because realistically, you can take what I say with a grain of salt and no harm done. But I guess my attempt is to open the floor and create the opportunity for parents to understand how their biases that they've inherited from their childhood could be framing and shaping the biases of their children now. And in the context of an evolving world, we need to reassess, are they still relevant for this time and place in 2025? And I believe if parents take the time to review them and reflect on their own biases, it arms us with a better ability to provide a safe space with compassion. It gives, and if the kids see you, your children see you doing this, they will eventually emulate that at some point in their future and equip them with the tools to find compassion in their own thoughts and behaviors, whether that's towards themselves or hopefully towards others. So to me, that's why it matters. And by opening ourselves to compassion and kindness and creating safe spaces, we set up the example for our kids to do the same. And therefore, when our children grow up and be decision makers and policy influencers and community leaders or business owners, they have a set of tools that allows them to emotionally process and reflect on whether or not the biases or the patterns of behavior that they have formulated through their conditioning as a child in their environment shapes how they act and behave in the future. And I was listening to this podcast with Jonathan Fields, who had a clinical psychologist whose name escapes me, but her research was on sensitive children and sensitive people and how sensitive people process information. And I believe our children are very, very sensitive, and the definition of a sensitive person is this deep processing time. And sensitive people were defined as having a deep processing time, which then allows them to reflect on what's happening around them. Understanding sensitivity, and it was complex, and I encourage you to listen to it because it's incredibly insightful into the human mind and kind of echoes some of the information that I've been sharing here, but it also validated what I was saying, is that we have these cognitive biases and we create these shortcuts that help us to act quickly or make decisions quickly, and therefore influence in the home environment in the deep subconscious level while young people are absorbing information and their brains are forming these heuristics that, we're in or out kind of decision making happens and you're either in or out. And she was also saying that our brains often don't really have a great ability to process in and out and hold them in the same space. You're either one or the other. So I guess that further challenges us to stop and think and explore our own biases before we make snap judgments as to whether people are in and out, and how potentially the human natural process is to have one group in and one group out. One group's better than the other if you belong to this group or that group. And in knowing that that's human nature, yet the science shows if we belong, if we feel like we belong, we have better health and well-being, then the challenge as an evolving species is to stop and reflect. And I challenge you to think about, what kind of Australia do we want to model for our children? And do we want it to be rooted in fear and division? Or do we want it to be one of diverse people thriving together, or diverse environments and communities thriving all together? And so this isn't about right or wrong. This isn't about not having Australian values. It's more about how do you want the future for your children to look like? Because one minute they could be the in, but with global megatrends, they could end up being the out. And so therefore we have a responsibility, or we can take this opportunity to shape compassionate communities and thriving communities with diversity, inclusivity, the capacity to be empathetic and resilient. And therefore, whether you're in the in or out group, regardless of race, colour, skin, economic situation, there will always be a safe space for people to be in Australia. And therefore, I challenge parents to take 5 minutes of your day to consciously, deeply reflect, how would I like my children to thrive in the future? And how would you like your future for your young people to look like so they can thrive? And start cultivating that now. And if you need to do a bit of self-reflection and deep healing, then I challenge you to take it even in amongst the chaos, even in the messiness of chaotic parenting. Find the time and space to regulate and reflect so that you are creating a safe space for your young people to also do the same, and giving them tools to be able to self-regulate and reflect, and hopefully harbour and build on some qualities of compassion, kindness, empathy, inclusivity, resilience, critical thinking, problem solving, and prepare them for the future that we have no idea of what it's looking like. So I hope that you found something useful in this podcast. And if you would like to subscribe, go to my Substack and have a read of some of my articles there, or check out some of the other podcasts that are coming up soon. I hope to have some really incredible guests on. One little spoiler, we will be diving into an AI expert about how to raise AI to help our young people raise healthy AI. So that's still to come. And a few other really cool guests who work with neurodivergent kids or work in the space of health and well-being across various levels that can inspire us as parents to create safe spaces for our young people so they can thrive. So I'm Steph, MagnetiK Mumma, signing off for this podcast, but I hope to see you in the next one. Thank you. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of MagnetiK Mumma. If you found it triggering or found yourself a little defensive, I challenge you to explore why and where it comes from. There's no blame here, just pure curiosity. Head over to my Substack to read more, connect with our community, and I look forward to our next conversation. I'm Steph, your MagnetiK Mumma.